Hey everyone, don't go away now, don't leave, don't swipe away from me. This is important, I have to say. I came home a little while ago after being at work at Stockholm University. I've been working with Beatriz, the astronomer, as you know. We work on that thing with BTC through this in the Baltic Sea.
That is the Baltic Sea anomaly investigation. He's part of the team alongside Dr. Villarroel. So that's what that is.
But Beatrice and I also work on finding life and intelligence out in space, especially near Earth.
Especially near Earth means low Earth orbit. That's their specialty.
When I got to work today, this new data is completely insane. I can't tell you everything right now. I can't do that for certain reasons because this has to be presented in a scientific way, as it is in that world. But I can say this.
So what he means there is that they saw the data, which is really recent. It shocked them, and they can't really talk about the details or the specifics because this is going straight to a scientific paper that I would say, presumably, Dr. Villarreal is writing at the moment. So that is my assumption.
I've never been as shocked as I was at work today. Both Beatrice and I feel a bit sick to our stomachs now. I can tell you that we now know things that very, very, very few people on Earth know. And we've said, Beatrice and a few others have this scientific data to share. But what's going to happen now is that they're working on it right now to present it internationally later on. I'm doing this because I could, but I feel like, why not? I have information now. And now it's happened. In a scientific way, it's been calculated, analyzed, and checked back and forth constantly. And apparently, things are happening around us. And as I said,
when he says around us, I think he means around Earth, not just around them. It's around Earth.
A little while ago, I understand why this information shouldn't come out to humanity. It's absolutely unbelievable.
I don't agree with that at all. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's information that is sensitive about humanity, it needs to come out. We have a right to know. And I get that you guys are going to do it in a scientific way through a paper, but why make that statement? That just doesn't make sense to me. People should know.
Now I know what it's about, and I wish I could tell you everything right now. I can't. I'm not allowed to. But I actually asked Beatrice. I mentioned this. She gave me approval to say this much. I can't mention what it's actually about, other than that it's a new scientific discovery that's been made, one that will shake things up properly. And I'm not joking. This is no bullshit. So stay on the lookout to find out more. As I said, Beatrice and I, astronomers at the university, this is something completely new, though they've been working on it for a while. But it's new data, new information, so incredible that you can hardly...
So that's a clue right there too, that they've been working on it for a while, meaning that it's possibly part of the Vasco project or the other project that they did, which is the ExoProbe project. But they did find new data over the last week or so. So what could that be?
Believe it's true. I've looked at the data and realized it's real, but I can't quite grasp it. Part of me can't believe it's been this way, maybe for a very, very long time. And this has nothing to do with the Baltic Sea object, nothing at all. This is probably something entirely different. So I know what it's about, and I'm obviously not scared, but still, damn cautious now. That's why I feel like maybe it's good to share something. But the true purpose of the whole thing, we'll discuss that later. As I said, now you know a little. But more will come, I promise. More will come. Beatrice will explain it herself in her own words. It'll take a little time. We have to process it ourselves because it's so overwhelming. It's completely insane. It's hard to process this. And now it's just thinking, okay, What? Wow. Wow. Now I understand. I work but now you know a little, at least. You'll have to use your imagination. I can't go into details. Thanks for listening. End. Dennis. Bye.
Okay, so what I'm going to do here now is that I'm going to talk about what I think might be going on because, and I'm going to preface this by saying I've reached out to both Dennis and Dr. Villarreal, and they obviously can't say anything, and I completely respect that. Even if they said what actually is happening to me, I do respect sources, and if they told me that I can't say anything about it, I would find a way to circumvent whatever they can't talk about so I can at least give you guys a clue. Given that they said nothing to me, I can speculate based on other data that is already out there. So I already gave you guys a little clue, but I do think that this discovery is more than likely related to Dr. Villarreal's VASCO and or ExoProbe projects that involve detection of anomalous transients or objects near Earth that suggest possible non-human or extraterrestrial technology. The data likely shows a compelling signal or event in astronomical observations, such as vanishing light sources or objects in geosynchronous objects that challenges conventional explanation. The shock and secrecy stem from the potential implications of confirming non-human activity, requiring rigorous scientific validation before public release. This is the white paper that Dr. Villarreal is likely working on right now. More details will likely emerge as Dr. Villarreal's team prepares a formal presentation, possibly in the coming months, I would say.
Beatriz Villarroel is a researcher in astronomy at the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics in Stockholm. She leads the Vanishing and Appearing Sources During a Century of Observations, or VASCO project, and the ExoProbe project. The VASCO project searches for vanishing stars with the help of automated methods as well as a citizen science project. Among the most interesting results from the VASCO project are the findings of anomalous multiple transients of unknown origin. Remember that. ExoProbe, that is a recently launched project, aims to find and locate an extraterrestrial probe in the solar system. In 2012, Beatriz Villarroel received a Crawford Scholarship for Young Astronomers from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for her research about quasars. In 2021, Beatriz won the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Prize in Sweden for the VASCO project. In 2022, she was selected as one of 15 worldwide L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science International Rising Talents. In 2023, she gave a TED Talk in Zurich on the topic, Why We Should Search for Alien Artifacts. You heard some clips from that TED Talk at the top of this episode. In September 2023, she received Heterodox Academy's Open Inquiry Award for Courage.
Here you can see an example. Look at the green circles. Only look at the green circles because the purple ones are scanning defects. So the green circles show you 9 objects that are there in one image, and they are never there again. Their brightness profiles, the shapes, the way how the brightness is falling off with the distance from the center is exactly the same as of any real star of the same intensity. It looks real. And moreover, we were comparing with images taken half an hour before, and there was nothing. So whatever happened, there were 9 objects that appeared and vanished within the exposure time of the plate, which is 50 minutes. We started wondering, is there any known astronomical phenomenon that could explain it? Well, supernovae usually take months. If you would have an asteroid, it would leave a streak or if it would be moving, if an asteroid moves in or out of an image, or 9 of them would move in and out of an image during an hour, you would see streaks. Or it would be so slow that it would leave a point source, but then the 9 point sources would be there also in the images before and after. They wouldn't just be there in one image and not the second. And we looked at various kinds of astronomical explanation, and we could exclude one by one. No known astronomical phenomenon can cause multiple of these objects appearing and vanishing. No natural phenomenon will do that. So then we wondered about possible instrumental issues, like maybe there was some different sensitivity of the plates to different sensitivity on the different kind of plates. But we had access to a plate that was identical, like just 6 days after, and it looked totally different. There you didn't have any 9 stars, while in our image on the 12th of April, we did have these 9 stars. We tried out different things like double exposures, high energy particles, and even if we cannot fully exclude those, it doesn't look too likely either, because we did some basic tests that weren't in support. Also, we need to remember that the photographic plates were much less sensitive to high energy particles than is the CCD. It's even less sensitive than our eyes. So while high energy particles are a problem for CCD images today, they shouldn't be a problem for the photographic plates. And moreover, they wouldn't leave these kind of brightness profiles. So of course, we had a very good referee. And now this was somewhere towards the end of 2020, in the beginning of 2021, when our referee asked, but why didn't you think about a very obvious scenario, especially in these pandemic times? What if somebody sneezes on your plates? So we had to test it, and we could finally show that, no, it doesn't seem to be that somebody sneezed on the plates and left the 9 sneezing transients. Another thought we were wondering about is whether what we see could be some kind of nuclear fallout from secret atomic bomb tests. Because, for example, X-ray images in the late 1940s and 1950s could detect atomic bomb tests, and it left some kind of fogged stars. And that would be a possibility. However, our plates were taken on the 12th of April 1950, and there were no atomic bomb tests that year in the United States. So we started running out of good explanations. Another thing that people have been talking about or asking us about is plate defects. They say, okay, but it's maybe just a plate defect that is round. Okay, but first, the plate defect, again, has a brightness profile. If it's a plate defect, it would need to have a brightness profile similar to the real stars in the field. And then you would need 9 of them that would need to have, coincidentally, each one of them would need to be matching the real stars in the field. And that's when things start getting very statistically improbable. So here is where I got interested in UFOs, because one of the ways how you could actually produce this kind of effect is if you have something flat and artificial that reflects sunlight as it is in orbit around the Earth. Then you could produce such a flash or such a transient. And in fact, if you would use the same instrumentation and watch the sky today, you would see these multiple transients. And why? Because you have millions of pieces of satellites that humans have launched there. And that is where it got interesting to me, to start wondering, like, oh, wow, what if what we see could be some kind of artificial object in orbit around the Earth that is reflecting sunlight, or even more interesting, if it could be emitting its own light. That would be quite fascinating. And this was in the paper. We presented this hypothesis in the paper that we published in 2021 in the scientific report. And since then, I've been very interested in this hypothesis. Imagine now you would have a civilization even similar to us Earthlings, that would be living on a in a nearby stellar system, and they would send us some Voyager-like or Pioneer-like probe, and maybe it would come here. It would take some 200,000 years, but it would come here, and it would be in orbit around the Earth, and maybe it would be orbiting the Earth for 500,000 years, and we would be seeing maybe these reflections from that probe sometimes, and we could see this kind of glimpse, or maybe even that probe would have broken up in debris, and we still would see the solar reflections of that debris that maybe has been there for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Now, that would be very fascinating, and that's how I got interested in the topic, because I want to know if there's another civilization, either similar to the Earth or much more advanced than us Earthlings, and if they could have made it here. So what are some of the predicted signatures of ET probes, if you look in these photographic plates? Because I like to do that. We work with predictions. You make a prediction and then you search for it. Well, one of them is to look for these multiple flashes, like we mentioned earlier. You can also have triple flashes if you have a rotating dish. And you might also have several flashes along a line. They don't have to be equidistant, because all depends on the geometry and of the object that is, and the way how it rotates, and that can get quite complex, the kind of surfaces it has. But these are some predictions, and we published these predictions in Acta Astronautica. We did some statistical tests that made a prediction of that. If you have an image of this size and you have a number of transients, that if you have at least 4 in a line, you're going to have very good probability for it to be matching the several flashes along a line. So the advantage with looking for several flashes along a line is that it's easy to separate against this other scenario of that maybe you have a plate defect, where the plate defect coincidentally has a star-like profile several times. So by looking for several flashes along a line, we can separate between these two scenarios as well. And indeed, we did such a search, and we found some examples. Many were 3 in a line, but then we had 2 statistically significant examples that actually came out. One from the 6th of August 1954, with a probability of 0.003. You can see here 4 flashes in a line and 2 more there that are unaligned. And another one from the 27th of July 1952, and you can see here 5 flashes in a rather narrow band, and you can estimate what's the probability of if you have 5 flashes in such an area, and that they align themselves in such a band, and that's going to be 1 in 10,000. So it's our absolutely best candidate for those along a line. Imagine now you could also localize it in 3 dimensions and get a spectra that would allow you to characterize the emission from this mysterious object, so that you learn something about the physics of it. Well, that is the idea of exoprobe. And our idea is to use a network of telescopes. We're going to build it up over time, that are specially designed optics that will permit the detection, validation of such transients associated with non-human intelligence objects, and to acquire spectra of it. And each telescope is going to use high-speed cameras, and we're of course going to use wide-field telescopes, as we want to see as much of the sky at the same time. And also they're going to be synchronized. And it is completely optimized to catch a brief appearance of the unidentified object, and to catch that short-lived transients that could last maybe just half a second, and to use that moment or catch it that moment, because you might never have a second chance again. And the idea is simply detect, localize, verify, reproduce, which is the most simple principles in science. And also we rely on the scientific method and on hypothesis-driven science by searching for specific identifiable signature from an ET probe or non-human object. And I say that because it is not the same as searching for UFOs or UAPs or the unidentified anomalous phenomena. We are looking for very specific identifiable signatures, and we're using predictions and hypothesis-based science, which means I am very much into talking about flying saucers. Because when we talk about flying saucers, we actually have a specific idea in mind, and we have a prediction. And when we have that prediction, we design the whole experiment to test the prediction, rather than looking through a data set for, because another way some people are working on is to, let's say, collecting a lot of reports of UFOs and find that thing that is difficult to explain. Yes, you will always find something that is very difficult to explain, but your experiment has not been designed in a way that you will be able to reliably say if it's a false positive. Now, if you design your entire experiment around looking, for example, for flying saucers, it will be a much cleaner way to test the hypothesis. And you actually will test the most important hypothesis around UFOs, which is if you are dealing with non-human intelligence or any other, or ET or whatever you prefer to call it. When we work, we also are trying to stay well beyond, we're going to stay outside the geosynchronous orbits, and we try to be even further beyond. Because why we do this is that we want to minimize the number of human satellites. We also don't want to be looking at space debris, which our project uses methods to filter away both satellites and space debris. And we want to search for things that have a minimal risk of being human. Because then we get rid of all the national security issues. We don't want to cause any stress in anyone. We simply want to look for aliens. And also, we will, by removing the national security problems, we also reduce all kind of false positives, and we make our life much simpler. And the whole method also allows us to have a spatial resolution, a time resolution, and a spectral resolution. So you get an instant spectra, and you can get a real-time validation through the use of multiple telescopes. Step 2, after you got your instrumentation, now when you have, let's say, 2 such plane wave delta rho telescopes, depending on how you select your distance between the two, you're now going to be able to, if you see a flash, you see this flash on the sky, and if it's seen in both telescopes, you directly can verify that, yes, this is a real flash. It's not something that just happened locally inside the telescope itself. No, you know it's real. But also, you can determine the distance to the flash if it's inside the solar system, since you're going to get a small offset. And here is where our first observatory is located here in Dark Sky, New Mexico. We had a long thinking between Sierra Remote, California and Dark Sky, New Mexico, and in the end, Dark Sky, New Mexico won. And here we have the first telescope. We also have a telescope taking the spectra here, and we hope to be renting this telescope if we can raise funds for another 30 or 40K. So the first phase, we hope for 3 observatories. And they're here in New Mexico. You can see there are exciting places nearby. We have Roswell not too far away, some 300 kilometers. And we have White Sands Missile Range. And we are not going to be watching in this direction, but we hope that the aliens will be flying here over our telescopes. Then, step 3, when we do all this, we select a baseline in such way that we can get rid of all objects inside our atmosphere. We're going to be watching far away, and preferably further than the moon, so that we know that if you find at very large distances, all the human objects are very well catalogued. So if you find something, you can directly see if it's a well-known mission or not. Then we have step 4 here, which is to remove satellites and human space debris. So I'm working right now on a paper together with some colleagues where we are testing my method to remove human satellites and space debris in order to look for ET objects. And we're trying this on data from the Zwicky Transient Facility in order to see how it works. I have done a small test of 40 hours with 40 hours of observations used. Now we're going to try to extend it to some 100 hours of observations to know what we might expect to find with the ExoPro project once we have the data collection phase. Then Space Laser Awareness, under the leadership of Jeffrey Marcy, are going to or have already installed a telescope there that takes spectra, low resolution spectra, that we can get immediately of all the objects in the field. So that will help us to know the chemical composition of the source, because of course, if it's a solar reflection that causes the glint, you're going to get the solar spectrum. And if you are having some kind of emission, let's say some very weird emission that you have never seen, well, that could possibly be the UFOs, and also let you know about the chemical composition, or you will learn a lot by that. So we have to simply do these synchronized searches with several telescopes, and hopefully later more. Because of course you want to add more telescopes, because the more telescopes you have, the bigger the range of altitudes you can measure. We want to reach out to 1 astronomical unit at least, and we want to also come closer eventually. Maybe eventually we even will be able to come as close as the low Earth orbit. And by having many telescopes, you can also have many more combinations of measuring the parallax, and you can increase the accuracy of how you localize it in 3D.
And so this quarantine, can you explain the quarantine and why are we under quarantine in the first place?
I mentioned it and coined that concept back in the 90s. And really what it is, if you want a passport to other star systems, you have to become a level 1 civilization, level 1, level 2, which we went through in the last episode. Because if you're still a warfaring civilization, you're going to be allowed to have a certain amount of alacrity, and freedom, and movement in your own solar system. But our solar system is Earth and a few other planets. You're not going to be going out interstellar, bamming around, because my CE5 contact teams have had contact experiences with civilizations that have never had the concept of war, because they didn't evolve from primates. We're 98% identical, our genetic material, to a chimpanzee. And those do organize into troops and engage in battle and tribes, and troops and tribes. And humans have this, I think, as sort of our legacy that we have to transcend as we become so technologically advanced that proclivity towards division, otherness, racism, us versus them mentality becomes an extinction consciousness. And so we can't, this life here is precious, this earth is precious, and humanity is precious. But to get to the next phase, we have to have universal peace. And so once a civilization reaches that point where they have a permanent peace, they have renounced resolving to military violence, for resolving differences, then the universe opens its arms to you. Until such time, it's truncated, it's limited. And I know people in the military I've spoken to and at the Defense Intelligence Agency where we had certain satellites pointed out targeting ET assets, and they just simply would shut them down. And it was an interesting series of conversations. The problem is the people running those projects feel that they should be omnipotent. They have this God complex of masters of the universe, and they don't like having their wings clipped, and that causes them to even be more aggressive. So there's an escalating tit for tat sort of things that have happened that need to be resolved. And it isn't going to be resolved with the level of consciousness that created it, as Einstein said. It has to be resolved from people who have cooler heads, wiser heads.
Yeah.
God forbid that this whole exo-racism comes into it, where, this civilization's good and this whole species is bad, and we're going to align with this one and fight that one. Great for a Star Wars movie. Horrible policy going forward because there's no way that's survivable. So these civilizations are waiting for us to grow up. I liken this to the phases of maturation of a human.
Yeah.
You have your infancy, childhood. Humanity right now is in its rambunctious adolescent phase. And the hallmark of maturity of our species as a body is universal peace. Not just world peace, but peace out there as well. So that's really the big undertaking that has to happen, and then we get cleared. Everything is possible at that point.
If we're trying to move out past our solar system, will they just maybe use their advanced technology to shut us down, turn off our power supply on our spacecraft? What do you think they would do to hold us back?
It's been made very clear that there's a red line here. You're not going to allow a group of, frankly, sociopaths who have this kind of amazing power and technology to go out and victimize completely innocent planets. It just isn't going to happen. It's quite clear that's not in the cards. We're going to get there. Yeah. I'm optimistic, but we're not there yet. So,
what do you think it will take to free ourselves from this quarantine that we're under right now?
Well, we have to become a peaceful civilization. So that is why it's very important that there be a global decision to keep all weapons out of space, to announce that we're not alone in the universe, and we need to have a overt, recognized, global, diplomatic contact with these civilizations, not let it be in the hands of secret military operations.
All right, good. Let's get started. There we are. All right. I'm going to get the commercial out of the way. Yaron asked me to speak about my Cosmic War Versailles template thesis. So if you've been reading the books, you've been familiar with some of it. These are all the books I'm going to be drawing some of my comments today from. And my thesis is that we're all creatures of our history. And this applies especially to the national security establishment in the United States of America after World War II, and especially with regard to the UFO problem. And as we're going to see in this talk, many of the men in the national security establishment after World War II had much of their worldview formed not so much just in World War II or by the Cold War, but actually by World War I. And last year I suggested at the Secret Space Program conference that, in fact, if you look at what's going on after World War II and with the establishment of what we are essentially calling a secret space program, a breakaway civilization, that these men would have formulated their policies on the basis of their experience to avoid a Tower of Babel moment of history and a repetition of things that may have happened in the distant past. And in that respect, I also suggested that they would go back and look at ancient texts to see if there was any guidance, if there was something in those texts that might be possible to formulate their policies from. And in this respect, the parallels between World War I and what I'm calling the Cosmic Versailles are truly astonishing. So my thesis is that the post-cosmic war period, I believe that there was an ancient cosmic war fought right here in our solar system, and that this may have created a Versailles Treaty situation, and that's what we're going to be examining today. So we've already looked back at San Mateo, This is what we're going to be talking about today. This is a two-part presentation. We're going to talk about the historical context, and we're going to talk about lots of artillery, since we're talking about World War I. We're going to talk about the mythological context, where we're going to be talking about lots of psychopathy. And then finally, we're going to be talking about the implications for the national security breakaway civilization complex, where we're going to talk about lots of paranoia. So now this is crucial. This is absolutely crucial because, again, as we're going to see at the very end of this talk, all of these things are in play with some of the biggest names that you're probably already familiar with in the national security establishment. As I indicated last year, there was a threefold strategic threat that the post-World War II national security establishment was facing. Communists, the post-war Nazis, and of course UFOs. And as I suggested last year, this would have forced them to create a Manhattan Project on steroids lasting several decades, but with the immediate need to develop technologies, reconnaissance technologies, potentially able to scout out and find out what the Soviet bloc was up to, find out where the Nazis were and what they were up to. That's a big part of my work. And then finally, not only to do this, but secondly, to introduce a program designed to deal with the problem posed by UFOs and to institute a long-range black projects technological research program to emulate the performance characteristics of UFOs if possible and achieve parity or near parity. And you're going to be hearing, I'm quite certain, from Dr. Paul Laviolette, one of my favorite researchers in this field, about some of these technologies. Now, this implies that the national security establishment had concluded, as they're trying to achieve parity, that UFOs, as I indicated last year, posed a potential national security threat because much UFO activity was concentrated over American and Soviet defense installations. And if you recall my presentation from last year, I indicated at a Soviet nuclear ICBM base in the Ukraine, at Bielogorovichia in the Ukraine, UFOs actually activated the launch sequence of Soviet ICBMs, leaving Soviet crews scrambling to shut this down and prevent a thermonuclear war. So we're continuing kind of my review because I want you to view my remarks today in the context of what we said last year. This is my revision and extension of remarks. And in this respect, last year I suggested that there's another thing that the national security establishment inevitably is going to undertake. They're going to try and undertake a study of ancient religious, mythological text and lore for the purposes of seeing if they could determine who was behind the UFOs. And secondly, if possible, where they were from. Thirdly, what they wanted. And fourthly, what their motivations were. Were they hostile? Well, certainly with all the activity over American defense installations, Soviet defense installations, interfering with both American and Soviet and presumably French and British nuclear weapons systems, that this was at least a provocative act, and hence they had the need to develop these black projects to achieve some sort of technological parity or near parity with the performance characteristics of UFOs. And if that's the case, then they also had the need to determine if psychological warfare operations could be mounted against them, what policies might be indicated by these ancient texts and their contexts. Now, it's that last question that, in my opinion, brings us to the idea that we might be dealing with a cosmic Versailles if, in fact, a cosmic war had been fought in the distant past of high antiquity right here in our solar system. And consider the importance of this. Because if there's a cosmic Versailles, if there's some treaty that you might be able to find traces of in ancient texts, in ancient lore, then they need to know the terms of that treaty. Is it still in effect? What happens if it's violated? And I think once you get into seeing what I'm about to present in this talk, you're going to see that this was very much possibly a part of their thinking. So their goal is to prevent a second interference, a second Tower of Babel moment of human history. Now, one last comment about my presentations last year. I argued that the appearance of UFOs in great numbers at the beginning of the human nuclear and thermonuclear era was possibly because the nuclear bomb, per the observations of the Nazi scientist working for Juan Perón in Argentina, Dr. Ronald Richter. You recall that I mentioned that Dr. Ronald Richter said that plasmas under electromagnetic stress, and what's a nuclear bomb? Well, it's a nuclear plasma. Under electromagnetic stress might possibly be gating energy in from the configuration of local space-time. That is to say, from the positions of the planets and so on, and when and where on the surface of the Earth the bomb is set off. So in other words, for a brief moment, it functions as a gateway, as a transducer of the zero-point energy as it's configured in local space. Therefore, summing all this together, if you're that national security establishment, and if your political, geopolitical, strategic, cultural views have been formed not only in the emerging crucible of the Cold War, but much more importantly, as we're going to see with some very famous examples, in the crucible of World War I, which, stop and think about it, folks, right now, at this very moment, 100 years ago, we were in the middle of World War I. And many of the men that formulated these policies went through that and were part of the policy formation culture of the then existing national security establishment in the United States and the other Western allies. So, this brings me to the thesis. I've suggested in many interviews that there's a direct analogy between the post-World War I settlement, between the Allied and associated powers on the one hand, and the Central Powers on the other, and that ancient cosmic war that I believe to have been fought by the gods within our own solar system. But I've left my detailed reasons for thinking this largely unstated, so you're going to hear them here for the first time. So let me state them clearly and unequivocally by way of a history lesson and lots of artillery. About 100 years and a few months ago, this rather dour-looking man, Field Marshal August von Mackensen was his name, in the month of April of 1915, launched what was supposed to have been a limited offensive in Tarnów-Gorlice in Galicia to help relieve the Russian pressure on Germany's Austro-Hungarian allies. But what happened was that his offensive was so successful and so brutal that the Russian lines began to collapse, to the point that Germany decided to go on a front-wide offensive in 1915. It nearly led, in 1915, to the complete collapse and exit of Russia from the war. That's how close this came. So if you can imagine that 4-year-long slaughter that was World War I, shortened to 2 years, Russia taken out of the war, all of that massive military machine that Austria and Germany fielded, then sent westward to deal with the Western allies. What made it possible was this man here. I told you we're going to talk about lots of artillery. What made it possible was this man here. This is Lieutenant Colonel Georg Bruchmiller. And we all know the stories, we've all seen the films, we've all read the history books of how on the Western Front the Allies and Germans just bombarded each other for weeks on end with artillery to create breakthroughs, supposedly, in the trench warfare system that held on the Western Front. This man changed the tactics completely on the Eastern Front. He believed in sudden, massive, coordinated artillery, infantry, cavalry movements with timetables. I won't go into the details, but by 1918, these tactics were then applied on the final German offensives in March of 19, beginning with the so-called Kaiserschlacht, the first German offensive in March of 1918, after the Russians surrendered to the Central Powers. On such a narrow front, this man concentrated over 6,000 tubes, 6,000 artillery tubes on a front of about 25 miles against the British lines. And in a 5-hour bombardment, hurled more ordnance on British lines than we dropped on Nazi Germany in all of World War II in 5 hours. And of course, the British were sent reeling, okay? The roar was so bad from that intense 5-hour bombardment, it could be heard 60 miles away in Paris. It could be heard, if you listened carefully, even in London. That's how bad it was. Now, why am I emphasizing all of this military pornography? It's because when we get to Versailles, something happens. And it's precisely these 6 points that indicate to me that there may have been a cosmic Versailles in place at the end of that cosmic war in distant mists of high antiquity. The 6 crucial points are these. Number 1, the family feud that was World War I was over. For consider, Kaiser Wilhelm II was the cousin of King George of the United Kingdom. He was the cousin via family relationships and marriage to Tsar Nicholas II. The second point is, watch this one. The second point is, Versailles, of course, you'll recall, stipulated massive war reparations. Germany had to pay massive war reparations to the Allies. And I want you to think of this in terms, borrowing the insights of Secretary Fitz, I want you to think of this in terms of a tithe or of the ancient practice of tribute to a conquering king. And so massive were the reparations on the Germans that what you're really doing is you're harvesting their national wealth and productivity of each and every last living individual German. So in a certain sense, it's even sacrifice. The third thing I want you to pay attention to is what did the Allied and associated powers do? Well, first of all, they took an inventory. They've just suffered 4 years of war, and then in the final year of the war, these massive German offensives with numbers of artillery that boggle the mind, of all calibers, from the very small up to the very large. So the first thing the Allies do is they inventory the German war machine and stipulate in the disarmament clauses of the treaty that the German Reich would be prohibited from the manufacture of certain types of weapons. And if you stop and think about this, if you've read my book, The Cosmic War, I put in that book the entire epic of Ninurta, an ancient Mesopotamian text. And I did that for a very specific reason. Because when you read this text, it's hardly an epic. It's like reading the index of the Sears catalog. It's simply an inventory. And most interestingly, this is an epic about actions being taken after a war of the gods. And the inventory is an inventory of the weapons that were used to fight this war. And some of that technology was taken by the victors and used and applied in other contexts. Some of the technology was destroyed, and a very small category of that technology that could not be destroyed was hidden. Fourthly, as a part of the stipulation and provisions of the treaty, the Versailles system set up a system of monitoring to ensure German compliance with the treaty. In other words, you don't rely on the enemy that you just defeated to tell you, oh no, we're not building any of that. You set up a system of monitoring. And this has both a public and a secret aspect, because the French, of course, insisted in the treaty that they be able to send their attachés and representatives to all the German heavy industry plants and inspect them to make sure that the Germans weren't producing any heavy armaments that they had just had the bitter experience of facing. But this also means that they set up a system of spies, and I want you to file that one in the back of your mind, because that's going to be a very crucial point. The fifth thing they did was they set up a quarantine zone around Germany and insisted, and this is one of the quarantine zones, this is the Rhineland, and this is actually a German map that shows you this is what was demilitarized, entmilitarized. This is the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland. And that extended, as you can see, to a zone of about 30 kilometers on the east bank of the Rhine, with Allied bridgeheads around the cities of Cologne, Mainz, and so on. So that whole area was demilitarized. It was a quarantine zone. They were trying to confine any potential German military action to a jumping off position behind the Rhine River, should it ever happen. So they set up a quarantine zone, incidentally another one around the eastern part of Germany in a rather different way. And I want you to file that one in the back of your mind. And then finally, the most significant point, World War I was really sort of Act I, as we know, in a great world war that the world fought from 1914 to 1945. And World War I ended more or less as a stalemate. Everybody's exhausted. We want to go home. We're tired of fighting. Let's call it quits. Now, if the national security establishment is formed in this crucible, this is the way they're going to look at things. They're going to look at recent human history, World War I, World War II, and apply this Versailles template to the reading of ancient texts and ancient mythology. So let's look more closely at this. What was World War I? Well, as I've indicated, it's basically a family feud. The Hohenzollerns are related to the Habsburgs, are related to the Windsors, also known as Saxe, Coburg und Gotha, are related to the Romanovs, are related to the House of Savoy in Italy. It's a big family feud. Interestingly enough, when you go back and look at the ancient Mesopotamian texts in particular that refer to this cosmic war, what you see is a war fought among the gods, which if you look at the gods, they're all related to each other. So it's a big family feud. It's a big civil war. Enki, Tiamat, Nergal, Mars, incidentally, Ninurta. These are all related to each other by dint of their descent from the supreme god An. And the Greeks have their versions of this, the Romans have their versions of this, the Aztecs have their versions of this, the Vedas have their versions of this, the Bible, Lucifer, Michael, the war in heaven. Everybody has a version of this cosmic war. So now, look at something else. In the Versailles Matrix, you have pay reparations. You pay us X amount of billions of dollars of Reichsmarks per year. or be subject to invasion, military occupation of your industrial zone, and compulsory payment taken out in the form of actual barter, actual dismantling of industrial plants and shipment back to France. And this, in fact, did happen in 1923 with the French occupation of the Ruhr Valley. They actually physically went in with military force, occupied the industrial heart of Germany, and compelled the Germans to make payment. Now, if you look at the ancient practice, what's sacrifice? Pay the tribute, pay the sacrifice, or be subject to military occupation, deportation oftentimes, look at the ancient Assyrians, or make your sacrifice, make your animal sacrifice, your human sacrifice, and if you don't, you'll have bad crops if you don't make your sacrifice to the gods. Now, I want to stress something here that's very important. If you look at most of these ancient texts and traditions, sacrifice begins to rise, begins to become an acceptable practice after some sort of war. Okay? So with that in mind, let's look at something else. This little quotation is from the History and Mythology of the Aztecs, the Codex Chimalpopoca, and is translated, as you can see, from the Nahuatl by John Bierhorst, and I've cited this in my book, Grid of the Gods, on page 208. Listen carefully. The Toltecs were engaged in battle at a place called Netlalpan, and when they had taken captives, human sacrifice also got started. Indeed, every kind of human sacrifice got started then. It was the devil's enemy who started them. Huemek sacrificed a human streamer, now listen carefully, thus making payment, a reparation. So look what we have. In just the Aztec tradition alone, just as we have, incidentally, in the Western Christian tradition, the idea of a primordial war followed by the institution of a bloody sacrifice to maintain the broken order and stave off economic collapse or payment by payment of a debt. It's a tithe. It's a tribute. It's a way of symbolizing that you own the wealth and labor of an entire civilization because they are defeated in war. Now let's go one step further into the distant past and this idea of a cosmic war. Sacrifice is also viewed as an analog to dismemberment that you see in some cosmological and metaphysical processes of the differentiation that leads to creation. In the Vedic text, this whole process of differentiation that creates all the fullness of diversity that you and I know and experience in everyday life, this is described in the Vedic texts as dismemberment. And so in some cultures, this idea of sacrifice expresses itself how? Linda Howe has done yeoman's work studying the phenomenon of cattle mutilations. And even in some cases, if I recall, Linda, you were talking on radio about human mutilation. And what is this for? Well, as I've suggested, and as Linda has suggested, this might be a component of the institution of some sort of reparations clause in some far distant cosmic treaty of Versailles. Okay? Oops. Now let's look at something else Versailles did in more detail and compare it to the ancient text. Let's look at the inventorying and destruction process. The Treaty of Versailles, for example, demanded that Germany turn over copies of its big road mobile basically 17-inch siege guns, the so-called Big Berthas that they used in World War I, you know, firing a shell that weighed a ton. And that Germany also turned over, especially to the French, a copy of the Paris gun. If you don't know what the Paris gun was a gigantic cannon that the Germans used to shell Paris from over 70 miles away. And that may seem unrelated to the phenomenon of space, but we're going to talk a little bit more about it in a moment. The Germans refused to turn over a copy of the Paris gun to the Allies. In fact, they claimed that they had destroyed it completely and destroyed the plans. And in fact, they went further. They passed a law after World War I forbidding any German who knew anything about the gun or had worked on it or maybe been part of its crew from talking about it to anyone. That was classified a top secret state secret. The Allies, for their part, carted off what weapons they could, studied them, number two, and made use of that technology from their former enemy in both military and other applications. This is sounding a bit like the Epic of Ninurta. And number three, they destroyed, or insisted that the Germans destroy, as much of the really nasty stuff that they could, and ordered the Germans not to build any more of it. And as I said, don't think you're going to get away with it because we're going to keep an eye on you. So in other words, don't build any more of these, and don't build any more of these. This, incidentally, is the Paris gun. This is the 17-inch Big Bertha. You can kind of see the scale of the thing. But look down here at the little man standing next to the Paris gun with a barrel so long that it had to be wired so the barrel wouldn't droop when the thing fired. Now, why did I put that in there? Because the projectiles from that weapon were the first man-made objects in lower outer space. It shot up into the stratosphere, and that's how it was able to achieve the long range. So the German space program really begins in World War I, and as Walter Bosley is going to talk to you after my presentation, there are indicators even earlier than that there's something going on in the world of black projects concerning space technology. But, oh, looky. In World War II, gee, all of a sudden, the Germans are trotting out this thing, which had an incredible range of 100 miles. And, oh, looky, gee, we may have found some of those old plans after all and maybe kind of updated them a bit. So, now, let's leave the Germans and go back to Mesopotamia and look closer at the Epic of Ninurta. Because this indicates that a similar, if not identical, pattern of the inventorying, the destruction, and then the secreting of technology is at work once again. Because in the Cosmic War, as I've indicated, I cite this at length. It's pages 222 to 227. The whole text is there. You can read it in all of its boring, detailed, blow-by-blow Sears catalog index glory. It's an inventory. It's a catalog. That's all it is. It's about that exciting to read. And there's three classes of technology. Well, there's the stones from the tablets of destiny. That's what the Epic of Ninurta is talking about. The war, the cosmic war, was fought for and over the possession of technology of mass destruction. There are stones in these tablets of destiny to be preserved and carried off by the victors for use and study in other applications. It says so right in the text. There are stones that are ordered to be smashed and pulverized. Don't build any more big cannon. Okay? And then finally, most importantly, there are stones that cannot be destroyed. There's some component of this ancient technology of mass destruction, whatever it was, that could not be destroyed. And so it had to be hidden. And listen carefully to how this is described. It's right up here on the slide. Ellel is the name of this stone. And in the text, the stones are addressed directly, like you're talking to them. Ellel, intelligently, you caused terror of me to descend on the mountains. And let me stop there. Because the word Akur in Akkadian, guess what? It can mean a mountain. And a mountain in these texts can symbolize a planet. And it's the same word that's their word for a pyramid. Okay? You caused the terror of me to descend on the mountains where discord had broken out. In the rebel lands you proclaimed my name among my people who had banded together. Nothing of your wholeness shall be diminished. It shall be difficult to reduce your mass to small pieces. You shall be greatly suited to the clash of weapons. You shall be set up on a pedestal in my courtyard. In other words, it's being kept out of public view. This is one of the gods keeping this for himself. So in other words, the implication is that the Ellel stone, whatever this may have been, was a kind of philosopher's stone, if you will, of ancient high weapons technology. It's a kind of ultimate weapon. And because it can't be destroyed, it's hidden. Now, let's go further. The Versailles Treaty stipulated that Allied and particularly French military attachés, as I've indicated, would have access at any time unannounced to all German heavy industry and armaments plants for the purposes of monitoring compliance with the treaty. Think about the implications of that. Because additionally, this meant that the Allies, and particularly the French, and you can't blame them, put into place and expanded all of their on-the-ground human intelligence inside the German Reich to ensure that the treaty provisions were being complied with. And incidentally, the other part of the story, as I've indicated most recently in my book, The Third Way, Germany developed the policy of using, listen carefully, using its big international corporations as proxies for the development of hidden arms technology in foreign countries, not even on German soil. Okay? So there has to be a system in place to ensure treaty compliance. Now let's go back to some ancient texts. Ever heard of the Watchers? Now, this is the Slavonic text of the books of Enoch. And this is the Oxford translation. I have a copy of this. I photocopied the cover here. 1896. It's a difficult text to get a hold of if you want to read the book of Enoch in a scholarly presentation with gobs of footnotes. This is the book I would recommend. But now listen to what it says. This is from chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. The men took and brought me up into the fifth heaven. And by the way, what's that reference mean? St. Paul ascends to the seventh heaven, fifth heaven. What's all of this numbering of heaven? What does that really mean? And I saw there many hosts, not to be counted, called Grigori. And their appearance was like men. And their size was greater than that of the giants. In other words, to put it bluntly, they're talking about our genetic cousins. And their countenances were withered, and their lips were always silent, unquote. In the footnote to this passage, the translators, Morphle and Charles, note that the Grigori is another name for the Watchers. that class of humanoid beings whose duty it was to watch and, if necessary, guide, that is to say, interfere with human affairs. Question: why was it necessary for humanity to be watched and guided? And I submit that the answer may be that in the aftermath of a cosmic war, which incidentally, in my view, may have included the destruction of an entire planet, all of Star Wars, it's what you would do. You'd destroy the inventory and technology that made such a war and the destruction of an entire planet possible, number one. And number two, you'd prohibit the development of that technology again. And number three, you would muddle the science to prevent humanity from achieving that kind of technological prowess again and misapply it. And you'd try and mold and direct human affairs. You'd have, in other words, the ancient version of a covert operative or an agent provocateur trying to steer events and shape public opinion and socially engineer society by dint of those types of intelligence operations to prevent, it's a form of soft power, to prevent the recurrence of a war of that destruction again. And this is exactly, of course, the Versailles template. But then, the translators go on to state something else in their footnote. I live for footnotes, by the way. They state that, quote, the text cannot mean that all the watchers rebelled. In other words, whatever this war of the gods was, whatever this civil war in the ancient pantheon, like the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and the Windsors and the Romanovs and the Savoys fighting each other, whatever this ancient war was, not all of the people in that category of ancient watchers or Grigori rebelled. But it was from that class that the rebels proceeded. So note the implication carefully. What you have now are two post-war, post-cosmic war elites. A good one, the victors, and a bad one, on or near planet Earth, watching and manipulating humanity. And again, World War I was, by any account, an unsuccessful war, because what did it leave in place in the defeated nations, especially Germany? Well, the Kaiser was gone, but that whole infrastructure, that whole German version of the deep state, the military class, the general staff, the industrialists, the big bankers, that whole class atop which the Kaiser sat was left in place. So the elite continued. And what the ancient text is telling us is exactly the same thing. The elites of both sides in this cosmic war continued. So they go on to state, it is, of course, just possible that the writer's scheme may differ from its conception above and be as follows, and listen carefully now. The rebellious watchers, with their prince Satanael, are confined to the fifth heaven. Again, what's this numbering of heaven? The subordinate angels who followed them are imprisoned in the second heaven, whereas the watchers who went down to earth and sinned with women are imprisoned under the earth. Unquote. And this is from pages 20 to 22. It's the note on the fifth heaven in the Morphle Charles text of the Book of Enoch. What you have here, my friends, I submit to you, is a quarantine zone. Somewhere out there in outer space around planet Earth, and to some extent inclusive of planet Earth. It's a cosmic Versailles template. So what do we mean by the fifth heaven, by the second heaven, by the seventh heaven? Why these constant references? And again, the Versailles template is very helpful here. Because Morphle and Charles also go on to state in their footnotes that it was, quote, under, listen carefully, under the sphere, idem est, within the orbit of the moon, which is the least under all, and is a firmament, and there the souls of the demons are. And note conversely that in pagan traditions, it's not the place that is reversed, but the moral status of the people within it that is reversed. Because for the Stoics, and even for an early Christian writer by the name of Tertullian, this within the orbit of the moon quarantine zone is the abode of the blessed. But you still have this conception of fifth heaven, seventh heaven, second heaven, under the sphere of the moon. So I want to peel the layers back and show you what's going on. Number one, we have a clear reference to a quarantine zone, which is defined by, secondly, a clearly defined astronomical and hence identifiable boundary, a natural boundary, defined by the orbits of the planets. Demilitarized the Rhineland. What did the Allies do at the Treaty of Versailles? They picked a clearly recognizable and more or less permanent geological feature on the topography of Western Europe and said 50 miles beyond the east bank of this river must be completely demilitarized. That's the quarantine zone. Thirdly, note what else has happened. Because with the reference to the moon, a natural base of operations is created for anyone intent upon the long-term observation of humanity in planet Earth and its compliance with any possible, maybe hypothesized, cosmic Versailles treaty. And since the moon is ready to hand, number 4, this might explain the sudden spike of UFO interest in and interference in human nuclear and thermonuclear weapons systems during and after World War II. And finally, there's clear indication that whatever the results of this cosmic war were in terms of interstellar politics or what have you, that the result clearly is that both parties to this conflict and their elites survived. So, we're in a bit of a moral muddle. Did the good guys win? Did the bad guys win? Are we the bad guys? Are whoever's out there the bad guys? Or neither? Now, we're getting to the crunch here. Because what might this mean for the national security state, for the establishment, as they're noticing these parallels, or possibly studying these parallels between modern human history and ancient texts? What are the implications for a secret space program? Well, number one, since we have some indications in some texts of a quarantine zone somewhere here in this solar system, in some versions of this quarantine zone, it's at the orbit of the moon. In some versions of the quarantine zone, it's at the outermost orbit of the then known planets, which would have been Saturn. Okay? There's a quarantine zone. This may indicate that human presence in or beyond that zone could be interpreted as an act of war or a violation of the stipulations of some lost cosmic Versailles. And this is my real point, folks. It's because of that one point alone that those in charge of the national security establishment are going to be going back and looking at these texts in the post-World War II world. And as we're going to see in a few slides, you'll recognize some of these men and recognize their role in World War I. And now, this brings us to the other idea, fragments of that treaty and its provisions seem to be appearing in ancient texts. So as a safeguard to this idea, it'll be necessary to ensure that human presence in outer space is not misinterpreted. And I suspect that this may be the real reason that when we sent lunar probes, first to the moon and then further out, sent probes out to the other planets, we made really darn sure that we put little placards and official notices on these things. Hey, we're coming in peace for all mankind. Who's the message addressed to? Why would they have suspected or insisted upon putting a message like that? Was it just to have a monument up there on the moon? Or was there another reason operative in placing these little notices on those early space probes? And what I'm suggesting is, of course, there was another reason for it. Then secondly, Adolf Hitler, of course, in 1936 remilitarized the Rhineland. He said enough. In other words, what he did when he marched those German troops across the bridges there at Cologne, Germany, was he served notice then and there that Germany was unilaterally withdrawing from the provisions of the treaty. So now let's look at the implications of what a cosmic Versailles might be, because as human international commerce becomes increasingly reliant upon space-based assets for financial clearing, stop and think of where we would be right now if we didn't have assets in outer space to conduct our transactions, or for that matter, our global positioning, our Google Maps, and so on and so forth. We're talking right now about increased space mining, mining of asteroids, mining the moon, mining Mars. This means, like it or not, folks, like it or not, that you have to have protection of those assets in order to conduct stable commerce. This means, like it or not, the militarization of space is coming. The real problem is that quarantine zone. Are we in a cosmic Versailles? This means that we will have to demonstrate, as I indicated last year, by some means, I call it kind of a space gunboat diplomacy, by humanity, to whomever, that humanity has acquired a rudimentary capability of engineering systems on a planetary and stellar scale, and that we might have the potential to weaponize systems on those scales, because you can't take anything for granted. If you fought a cosmic war in the midst of prehistory right here in the solar system, and if they're still out there, and if they're still watching, lots of ifs, but this is a game that you cannot get wrong. You must assume the worst case scenario. You must. That's why you put into place all of these secret black projects, to ensure that the next time around, humanity will be able to defend itself against the interference from the gods or the demons or whatever. Those types of demonstrations, that type of space gunboat diplomacy, that type of, if you will, interstellar psychological operations, might be, therefore, intended to force a renegotiation of the tribute and sacrifice component of any cosmic Versailles that might have been put into place long ago, particularly since it will not be lost upon the technocrats and oligarchs of any such breakaway civilization or secret space program that with the advent of Christianity and its influence over a significant part of the world, that the payments of sacrifice ceased completely. Why? Well, in Western Christian thinking, because Christ makes what? The perfect and infinite sacrifice. So that whole system goes. But that might have been a treaty violation, you see. So that renegotiation, let's think in more modern terms. That renegotiation might have taken the form of commodities payments or of slaves. And by the same token, if that ancient treaty stipulated, well, we need so much sacrifice from you, symbolize it, by offering your firstborn or whatever, it might mean that that whole sacrifice culture simply went underground. And I think if you stop and think of certain things in the news over the past few years, there's some suggestive evidence out there that that might indeed be the case. Finally, if you're dealing with a cosmic Versailles situation, then the clear implication are also, first of all, both sides survived. Secondly, and the question is, are they still around? And secondly, that the first stage of the conflict is over. And that means there's a possibility of a second one. And therefore, a renewal of it at some stage in the future. Could this be the reason that we've been reluctant to pursue the manned space program beyond the moon landings in the 1960s, to extend that manned program into outer space, further away from Earth? Now, given that this Versailles template, as I'm calling it, dictates that not only some sort of quarantine zone was established or instituted in local celestial space around clearly defined astronomical boundaries under the sphere of the moon, and incidentally the expression under the Earth, I think, is an astronomical reference. It doesn't mean under your feet in the ground. I think it means under the plane of the ecliptic. Okay? It's another one of those astronomical boundaries. This implies that there was some sort of monitoring or espionage project put into place to monitor humanity, to ensure compliance with those treaty provisions, especially in the manner of tribute, sacrifice, and making darn sure that humanity is not going to develop these technologies. So in other words, there's yet another reason perhaps for the secrecy of these black research projects. They're not trying to keep it secret from us, but perhaps from someone else. Okay? And we're all poker players here. Do you ever really show your whole card early on in the game? Of course not. So this means something else. Any program of the technological emulation of UFOs must be accompanied by a counter-espionage program to identify and mislead any watchers. Such a program would depend on a massive surveillance program. What do we got? And B, on the acquisition, listen, of a massive genome DNA database. Because remember what the text said? They look like us. They're just a lot bigger. A massive genome DNA database to identify those with non-human but humanoid genetic signatures, our genetic cousins. Think Ancestry.com. And now one final curveball. In my book, The Cosmic War, I recount this war from a lot of different ancient texts. And there's something I began to notice about these ancient tablets of destinies, these ancient technologies of mass destruction. I think they were biometrically activated. You had to have the right retina scan. You had to have the right DNA. Otherwise, they wouldn't work. That's why only the gods could possess them. And if you suspect all that, and if you're invading a bunch of Middle Eastern countries to collect artifacts, and not just oil, you're going to start looking for it. And the only way to do that is through a massive surveillance program coupled with biometric databases. Guess what the FBI wants to do right now? Huh? Fifthly, since the ancient texts, particularly the Mesopotamian and Greek traditions, indicate that a cosmic war occurred in our own celestial neighborhood. What's Kronos in the Saturn? So in other words, the whole Greek mythology of the Gigantomachy, the war with the Titans, this is all interplanetary right here in local celestial space, if you interpret the text in that fashion. And you have a bunch of other characters, one of the most famous being, and you're probably going to hear about this character from Dr. Brandenburg, Nergal, otherwise known as, that's his Mesopotamian name. Akkadian name is Heracles, Hercules, Ares, Mars. Okay? This means that there might be remnants of the technology used to fight that previous war on those planets. So what's humanity going to do? Leave it there? Set up an international planetary, historical site marker? Or go looking for it? So, while the public message placards on human space probes might indicate we come in peace for all mankind, the possibility exists that a covert purpose exists for the exploration of these bodies and for the recovery and analysis of some of these ancient technologies in our cosmic Versailles template. So final slide, if you've been counting the slides, this is the 33rd slide. Now, I believe, definitely, that it's evident from the behavior of the technocrats running this show, supposedly, and who are concerned with monitoring space and particularly UFO affairs, from the concern to secure human thermonuclear weapons systems against any outside interference, human or otherwise, and any space systems against UFO interference, to the indicators of the developments of hidden technologies and energy systems. You'll hear, I hope, from Dr. LaViolette. If you don't know his books, folks, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion is, as far as I'm concerned, the textbook on the thinking and the technologies that are out there in the public record. To the development of a massive surveillance state. Look what we're living in now. Rapid on-the-spot. Why all of a sudden are we hearing about rapid on-the-spot DNA sequencing technologies? To the sending of messages on human space probes assuring whomever of our peaceful intentions. Ja, wenn wir marched across the Rhineland bridges, our intentions are entirely peaceful. Well, you know what the British response of the day was? Well, they're just marching back into their own country after all. It becomes clear, in my opinion, that these patterns and these policies corroborate the possible existence of this Versailles model as a template for policymakers of the breakaway civilization and the National Security Group. And this template has indeed informed the behavior and influenced the policy-making culture of that group, especially as regards to the existence of a covert space exploration and rearmament program. After all, what did Germany do between the wars long before Hitler ever took power? German rearmament, my friends, was underway as early as 1923. Why? Simple. Germany is one of the great powers of Europe, in the center of Europe. To demand and insist that it completely be defenseless against any potential enemy simply wasn't going to fly. The Germans had to. So they had to make peace with the other pariah nation of the era, the Soviet Union. So who did they build the industrial plants for? Joseph Stalin. Where did their military officers train with the weapons that they were prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles? In Russia, with Russians that they would fight in World War II. I've always thought it very ironic. Marshal Tukhachevsky, famous Soviet marshal liquidated by Stalin, was a personal friend of the German Colonel General Heinz Guderian. And these were the officers that squared off in 1941. So in other words, the infrastructure of rearmament was carried out by proxy nations, out of German soil completely. And I think that's what these men that put into place this system did. And that's why it's being kept so secret. And indeed, it may not even be produced here on Earth. It may be being produced right under our feet. So that's it. Thank you.
And Edgar D. Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And after years of research, their verdict is unequivocal.
I happen to be privileged enough to have be in on the fact that we have been visited on this planet. And the UFO phenomenon is real, although it's been covered up by our governments for quite a long time.
Whoa! Hang on a minute. Well, this is big. Whoa! This is all of this is quite a shock to me.
Well, I'm sorry you haven't been reading the papers recently. It's starting to open up quite a bit.
So you're telling me? Well, there's a lot of information to take on board. Hang on a minute. I mean, listen. I've heard crazy UFO nuts tell me this kind of thing before. I've never had Dr. Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, a respected scientist in his own right, announced to me that we've been visited by aliens from other planets and that they definitely are out there. There's no debating it.
Well, that's the first time you've ever talked to me, or I've told you about it before.
Знаете абсолютно все. Ну вот, например, прилетали на Землю инопланетяне. Вот те самые зеленые человечки.
Марьяна, значит, рассказываю вам первый и последний раз. Вместе с передачей чемодана с ядерными кодами президенту страны приносят специальную папку. На ней написано «Совершенно секретно». И она целиком и полностью посвящена пришельцам, которые посетили нашу планету. Одновременно предоставляется доклад от абсолютно закрытой спецслужбы, которая занимается контролем пришельцев на территории нашей страны. Значит, две эти папки передаются вместе с ядерным чемоданом. После прекращения полномочий, соответственно, эти папки передаются новому президенту. Более подробную информацию на эту тему вы можете получить, посмотрев известный хроникально-документальный фильм «Люди в черном». Вышло несколько версий.
Сколько их среди нас?
Сколько их среди нас, рассказывать не буду, потому что это может вызвать панику.
If in that video you were listening when he said the well-documented documentary Men in Black, and everybody laughed, they were probably laughing and they were making fun of him in a lot of the articles I read because they thought he was talking about the movies Men in Black that we all watched. But in reality, he was talking about a documentary called Men in Black. But it only verifies his standing even more because there really is a documentary, it's Russian, called Men in Black.
And you know this, for years, Neil Armstrong refused to be interviewed. I found that to be one of the strangest things of anything. You would think that the first man on the moon, the national hero that he is, would have talked to everyone about the experience, about the wonder. That didn't happen.
His role model was Lindbergh, and Lindbergh became a very public person and was very much out there with his political views and all that. You'd think that Neil would have at least wanted to be a role model for the next generation. Instead, he became essentially a recluse, a hermit. And on every anniversary, they would wind him up and trot him out in public. The most interesting one was during the Clinton years at the White House on the 25th anniversary, where, do you remember what Armstrong said, the most stunning thing that an astronaut could say, and I think in this milieu get away with it?
Give us the quote.
Well, he said two things. At the start of his speech, he compared himself and the other astronauts to birds, to parrots. And he then made a joke and he said, and parrots don't fly very well. Well, what else do parrots do, George?
They repeat what they're
they
told.
Are told.
Plant his foot on the surface of the moon has been a pioneer in many ways. And Mr. Armstrong, in asking you to come to the podium, may I say that millions of Americans have admired you not only for your achievement, but for the quiet dignity with which you have conducted yourself and represented not only our country, but humankind. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Mr. President, members of Congress, fellow astronauts, ladies and gentlemen. Wilbur Wright once noted that the only bird that could talk was the parrot, and he didn't fly very well. So I'll be brief. This week, America has been recalling the Apollo program and reliving the memories of those times in which so many of us here, colleagues here in the first rows, were immersed. Our old astrogeology mentor, Gene Shoemaker, even called in one of his comets to mark the occasion with spectacular Jovian fireworks. And reminding us once again of the power and consequence of celestial extracurricular activities. Many Americans were part of Apollo, about 1 or 2 in each 1,000 citizens, all across the country. They were asked by their country to do the impossible, to envisage, to design, and to build a method of breaking the bonds of Earth's gravity, and then sally forth and visit another heavenly body. The principal elements, leaving Earth, navigating in space, and descending to a planet unencumbered with runways and traffic controls, would include the major requirements necessary for a spacefaring people. Today, a space shuttle flies overhead with an international crew. A number of countries have international space programs. During the space age, we have increased the knowledge of our universe 1,000-fold. Today we have with us a group of students, among America's best. To you, we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers. There are places to go beyond belief. Those challenges are yours. In many fields, not the least of which is space, because there lies human destiny.
Eager, idealistic faces, riveted on the first man on the moon, talking to them, and he looked at them and he said, "There are wonders beyond belief. There are truths to be revealed if one can remove truth's protective layers." Now, where in the world does one get the idea the truth has to have protection to be found out?
U.S. Air Force Airman Second Class Carl Wolf became an accidental witness to the first photos developed showing bases on the dark side of the moon. He saw multinational top clearance access individuals secretly huddling over the photos that looked to clearly show structures protruding over the lunar landscape, photographed by Lunar Orbiter 1 in 1966. As a director of intelligence for the U.S. Air Force Tactical Air Command at Langley, Virginia, beginning in 1965, he was privy to all Apollo mission photographs sent to Earth during their missions around and to the moon. As to the Lunar Orbiter 1 photos in 1966, he believed these photos would be revealed to the world within days or weeks. Over 30 years went by in absolute silence. He eventually realized this story was much bigger than anything he ever imagined. Not only were the moon structures of non-earthly origin, but upon his retirement from the Air Force, he was yet to see disclosure of these findings at all. He came forward to talk about it long after retiring from the U.S. military in 2001, when he joined Dr. Stephen Greer at the Disclosure Project National Press Club event in Washington, D.C., alleging NASA was intentionally covering up their findings. He knew this to be true firsthand.
Good morning. My name is Carl Wolf, and I was a precision electronics photographic repairman with a top secret crypto clearance in the United States Air Force. I was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. In 1965, in mid-1965, I was loaned to the Lunar Orbiter project at NASA on Langley Field. Dr. Colley was in charge of that project. They had problems with a piece of electronic equipment that was bottlenecking their production of photographs. I went to the facility, and when I walked into the facility, there were scientists from all over the world. I was stunned, actually, to see people at a NASA project from all over the world. It didn't make any sense to me initially. I was taken into the laboratory where the equipment was malfunctioning. I couldn't repair it in the dark. I asked to have it removed. A Airman Second Class was in the dark room at that time. I was also an Airman Second Class. I was interested in how the whole process functioned, how the data got from the lunar orbiter to the laboratory. I asked the young man if he'd describe the process to me. He did. About 30 minutes into the process, he said to me, in a very distressed way, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And then he proceeded to put photographs down in front of me, and clearly in these photographs were structures, mushroom-shaped buildings, spherical buildings, and towers. And at that point, I was very concerned because I knew we were working on compartmentalized security. He had breached security, and I was actually frightened at that moment. And I did not question him any further. And a few moments later, someone did come into the room. I worked there for 3 more days, and I remember going home and naively thinking, I can't wait to hear about this on the evening news. And here it is, more than 30 years later, and I hope we hear about it tonight. And I will testify under oath before Congress that what I'm saying is the truth.
The United States government, for example, demands astronomers, astronauts, and many other workers at NASA sign an oath of confidentiality. Upon breaking this oath, you could face a conviction of treason, a crime which carries the death penalty. However, regardless of this, over the past few years, more and more individuals from around the world have bravely began to blow the whistle on these secrecies. Dr. Ken Johnston, former director of NASA's Department of Photographic Evidence, has stated that during his stay at the agency, he was able to see original photos of countless ruins, pyramids, and intact temples all resting upon the moon. Not only are there now a number of independent testimonies made by numerous figures from within these space agencies and the accompanying programs, confessing to the concealment of ancient ruins on the moon's surface, but we also have compelling physical evidence of such structures, including photographs released by NASA themselves. One was snapped by the Apollo 17 astronauts in 1972. Subsequently uploaded to the official NASA website, it was originally labeled as overexposed. However, as technology has evolved and computer software has become more inept at refining images, it has revealed something amazing. Along with apparent pyramidal structure, clearly seen within this image, some investigators have also highlighted a possible monolith in the foreground. Was Space Odyssey trying to tell us something? Predictably, many people have come forward attempting to discredit this discovery. Yet, fortunately for us, in the December of 2008, the Hubble Space Telescope took some extremely intriguing images of its own. Images which seem to corroborate the once overexposed Apollo photo. Do these images actually show ancient ruins upon the surface of the moon? If this is the case, how did they get there? Or more importantly, who could have built them? Are these relics proof of an ancient space-going civilization? Or maybe extraterrestrial activity? Regardless of how they got there, we find their existence highly compelling and could be perceived as a possible motive for turning the space programs into black projects. Maybe we did go back to the moon. It's just most were never told about it. After all, knowledge is power.
And the reason why I can say that is I'm actually part of a group called the United Family of Anomaly Hunters, and we've cataloged about 58,000 anomalies that we've downloaded from NASA archives, European Space Agency archives, and also Indian Space Agency archives now. And we've actually downloaded close to 1 million images, but out of that we got about 56 to 58,000 actual anomalies cataloged and documented. And on these anomalies, we've got plenty of bases on the moon. We've got lots of structures, clear structures on the moon.
NASA's Curiosity rover arrives on Mars. Just beneath the surface, NASA scientists are expecting to find red oxidized iron dust, and plenty of it. What they're not expecting to find is evidence of a nuclear war. A devastating conflict that seems to have taken place on Mars 300 million years ago. Curiosity rover has been sent to Mars to analyze the chemical composition of the red planet. What it finds, to the surprise of planetary scientists, are significant amounts of xenon-129.
The Mars Curiosity rover found that the abundance of xenon-129 is much higher than what we see here on Earth. What process is creating this enhanced abundance of xenon?
Scientists around the world struggle to explain the presence of this radioactive isotope. Among those analyzing the data is Dr. John Brandenburg, a former NASA physicist and deputy manager on the Clementine moon mission. Brandenburg is amazed for one simple reason. Xenon-129 is the byproduct of nuclear weapon explosions.
I have shown this to several nuclear weapons experts, and they have affirmed that this is nuclear weapon signature. There is no other process that can create such a xenon spectrum.
Earth has experienced over 70 years of atomic bomb testing, each time leaving traces of xenon-129. But the xenon 129 reading on Mars is still 2.5 times higher than that found on Earth.
The presence of certain elements on Mars indicate that there was a nuclear explosion or explosions on the surface of Mars at some point in the planet's history.
Brandenburg observes 2 nuclear hotspots in the northern hemisphere of Mars, where radiation levels are higher than anywhere else on the planet. What's more, it appears the nuclear blasts were occurring in midair, above the surface.
What's also interesting is what is not found. There is no crater at either site, indicating that these explosions were airbursts.
The size of the radioactive hotspots leads Brandenburg to a devastating conclusion.
We're talking nuclear weapons the size of the Empire State Building, dropped from space and detonating kilometers above the surface.
Historically, if you look at pictures and listen to first-hand accounts of the explosion of the bombs at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it's the same sort of thing. No crater, but massive explosion, massive expanse of energy, total destruction, everything in that energy's path.
Brandenburg has analyzed the Mars rover data to establish when this nuclear holocaust occurred.
Best estimates for timescale based on isotopic evidence is that this happened 300 million years ago.
This could turn our concept of Mars completely on its head.
Many scientists believe that millions of years ago, Mars had an atmosphere and liquid water, conditions where life could thrive.
So, how long did this situation go on? How long has this been going on Mars? Roughly 4 billion years. We're looking at a planet that apparently had life on it, massive photosynthesis, oceans of water, a greenhouse, and it lasted apparently around 4 billion years. That's a hell of a lot different than what they say. I'm sorry. That's very different from lunar Mars synthesis. Now, what happened? That's what Mars used to look like, apparently. And now it looks different. Apparently Mars was also the site of a catastrophe of some sort. What sort of catastrophe? Well, Mars did suffer a very large impact late in its geologic time. It's the Leo impact, it's the Chicxulub Mars. It's almost the same size as Chicxulub, only it happened to a planet only half the radius of Earth, so it had 1/4 of the surface area, and it was a planet that only got half of the sun. So Mars was kind of running on the edge, and then this impact occurred. To show you where the Leo impact was, it's right there, north. So you can see it happened in a place where there are hardly any craters. Happened on the young part of Mars. Now, we also know, however, that life is very durable, especially if you're already living close to the asteroid belt and getting whacked periodically. If you have an ocean of water, that stores an enormous amount of atmospheric gas, or CO2, and also serves as a big thermal flywheel. So Mars had a big stabilizing element in the ocean. So this would have mitigated, to some degree, the effects of any big impact. However, it makes a good story. And, you know, it's like a Okay, Mars is next to the asteroid belt, and finally it got whacked and couldn't survive. So, however, it's like a good Sherlock Holmes story. Yeah, but the dog didn't bark. And there's something fishy about this. Mars is not only exotic in being like displaying an Earth-like past, it also has some very strange isotopic anomalies relative to other solar system reservoirs. In particular, it has a lot more xenon-129 than xenon-132. Everywhere else in the solar system, including the comet they landed on, those two are almost the same. The same on Earth, the same on Jupiter, the same in the solar wind, the same in ground-up meteorites from the asteroid belt, except on Mars. Mars sticks out like a big sore thumb. Where have we seen something like this before? There's only one place. It's called an R process. There's a well-known meteorite in the meteorites community. It's not from Mars, by the way. It's called Allende. It's carbonaceous chondrite 2, type 2. It was famous because it was the first meteorite where they identified a lot of organics. Apparently came from the asteroid belt. It's 4.5 billion years old. And in it has kind of tarry stuff in it, and then this dust. And the dust is very refractory. Apparently we're looking at grains of the original high temperature solar nebula. When you take out those, when you dissolve with solvent or tar and isolate just that dust, the sample of the original primordial solar nebula, and heat that dust until all of the gas comes out, the xenon isotope spectrum matches Mars' atmosphere almost exactly. It's because it's from a supernova. And that's been well established. So, however, there's another place where we see our process, and that's in nuclear weapons. We know a supernova did not go off on Mars. There wouldn't be any Mars there. Something resembling a supernova. At least that is the only known phenomenon that gives the xenon spectrum and the other radiation. I haven't given this a half-hour talk. I haven't gone into the other radiation features on Mars. Apparently, the surface of Mars was bombarded by high-energy neutrons at some point in recent geologic time. So, we love a mystery. Cause of death of Mars, unknown. By the way, it happened just about the same time as the great Permian extinction. It's killed off 95% on Earth. The oceans died in extinction. Only cockroaches. You should ask them what happened. But went under deep hypnosis, you can get him to talk about stable lives, past lives. Anyway, summary. There are water channels over wide ages and, of course, an ocean bed. That means we had to have had a stable greenhouse, not just a flash in the pan greenhouse. The only way to get a stable greenhouse we know of and explain what we see on Mars is it had to have a massive amount of oxygen. The only way to get a massive amount of oxygen is the same way we get it on Earth, photosynthesis. Photolysis is self-limiting. Photosynthesis, though, goes explosively. So we had to have a biosphere on Mars. And Apparently we had a stable Martian dial for a long, long time, billions of years, and then we had some catastrophe. I just add this at the bottom. Not a safe concept. Mullon says strange things have happened in the solar system. And planets like Earth have been reduced to Mars. Apparently, the universe is fully capable of doing that. So, that's all I have for right now. Any questions? Yes?
Well, I assume you're proposing that a supernova killed off Mars.
No, I'm not proposing that. Because it would have killed off everything else in the solar system.
Yeah, that's right.
It would have destroyed. You can't have a supernova on Mars. But the xenon from this R process matches Mars' atmosphere. And it's funny, no one will talk about it either. No one. They don't talk about it. Even though the Allende meteorite from old Mexico is a famous meteorite, well known. It's one of these things where when they landed on Mars and took the samples of the Mars atmosphere, saw that big spike in Xenon 129, a bunch of guys looked around the table at each other, and then somebody said, well, is there any comments? No. Yes?
Add to that the Viking satellite photos of the face and the whole controversy that touched off that's still going on about the Cydonia region on Mars. Now, I'll be honest again and say that when I look at those photos, even the more recent photos that supposedly disprove the face that's nothing but, a mound, I'm looking at it exactly the same way that Hoagland is looking at it and seeing a very decayed object, an artificial object.
Right.
And there are too many other oddities that are not even on Cydonia about Mars. There are clear indications of pyramidal structures that I can't see any geological explanation for that pepper the surface of the planet. There are just too many odd pictures that you can go online and look at from NASA's own photos and see all of this stuff that look like parts to automobile engines and, fossilized somethings and,
right. And we know that they make a habit of removing those things from the pictures over time.
Oh, yeah, they do. They put them up and then people start saying, oh, look at there. And then they go back and airbrush this stuff out.
On July 25th, 1976, a probe launched by NASA named the Viking Orbiter 1 took pictures of an area known as the Cydonia region on Mars. In those images, what appeared to be a face could be seen. To be honest, I have always dismissed the idea that the images actually showed a face carved in rock, like the Egyptian Sphinx, and I still dismiss the idea for reasons that I will explain later. Nonetheless, the images gave birth to what became a legend about Mars that simply would not go away. More than 20 years later, other probes were sent to Mars that took photographs of the same anomaly. 2 from NASA and 1 from the European Space Agency. Now, the later pictures were of much higher resolution, and space officials released the images claiming that the so-called face on Mars was nothing more than a pile of dirt and rocks showing no real facial characteristics. Well, the mainstream news media seemed to rejoice, spreading the officialdom claim of no face on Mars to every nook and cranny of the public realm, essentially positing that the entire face idea was resolved. End of story. I remember watching the entire spectacle with considerable humor, sometimes amazed at how easily the public's attention could be focused on a particular idea to the exclusion of everything else, even things that were right in plain sight. You see, when I looked at the higher resolution images of the so-called face on Mars, I did not even look for a face. What I noticed right away was that there were parallel and perpendicular lines on the feature, lines that simply were not usual for any natural phenomenon. lines that suggested artificiality, lines that suggested that somebody built something on Mars long ago, and the ruins of whatever they built were still detectable. Let me show you what I mean. Here is a high-resolution image of the so-called face on Mars. Look in this area of the image. There appears to be a clear corner with two very straight perpendicular lines. Curious, I placed a line on top of the longer edge using Photoshop, copied that line and moved it without rotating or transforming it to the other side of the anomalous rock formation, thereby ensuring that both lines were exactly parallel. Then I placed another line along the top of the image, exactly following the contour of the edge in the image. What I discovered is that the top line was exactly perpendicular to the two parallel lines, and together they perfectly outlined that end of the topography of the anomaly. At the other end of the anomaly, there was what appeared to be a semicircle that connected both parallel lines. I then took a perfect circle, cut it in half, and connected it to the ends of the two parallel lines, and it fit perfectly, following the topography of the anomaly like a glove, so to speak. In my mind, this was not a face, but a true anomaly that had surface features that were nearly impossible to form by natural erosion processes. These were parallel and perpendicular lines, plus a semicircle that seemed to be evidence of past civilization activity, however ancient. Quite simply, the spectacle of whether or not the anomaly was a face seemed to distract the public from seeing the obvious. And I even wondered if this could spend a moment discussing the verifiable elements in this first target, the face on Mars, as it exists right now. As can be clearly seen in the target image, in the center of the anomaly, there is what appears to be a mountain or hill with a rugged terrain. There are a few deep crevices in the image. Also, the raised center area of the mountain slopes downward and meets a flatter plane. The entire anomaly, as outlined with the black lines in this image, seems to be raised up on a more or less level surface, with sloping sides leading to an extensive plain below. We can call this outline with the black lines the perimeter of the anomaly. There is very little variation in the elevation along the perimeter. The perimeter is essentially flat. There is a raised area near the anomaly's so-called upper left corner in the image. Note that this raised area appears rough on top, but it is more or less level. Interestingly, below the flat area on the sloping sides is an area that appears to have a somewhat terraced surface. You can better see the terraced edges when we place lines on the contours of what I will be calling the terracing. Now, I am not calling these edges actual terracing. It is just that they have the appearance of terracing, as is commonly done on sloping sides of mountains. Again, this corner, which is near the terraced contours, is one of the most striking aspects of this image. That is a perfectly perpendicular corner with extremely linear parameters, and that is not something that tends to occur through natural processes. So, to summarize, the verifiable elements are a harsh, dry and dusty, cold and barren terrain without vegetation or water. There is a high peaked area that slopes downward, leading to something that looks like a perimeter with linear characteristics. There is also what appears to be the eroded remains of terracing along the sides of a sloped area. Also, along the terraced lines, there appear to be regular dimpled or indented areas, making me wonder if things may be near the surface that are regularly spaced, thereby influencing the surface erosion patterns. And of course, the air is very thin, to say the least, and it is bitterly cold.
November 2016. After a 3-year study of the keyhole formation discovered on Mars, an independent research team led by the director of the Cydonia Institute, George Haas, publishes their findings. The team determined that the formation exhibits such perfect symmetry that it is highly unlikely to be the result of natural erosion.
It appears what we're seeing on Mars is evidence of some unknown extraterrestrial culture that I think may have been telling the story of where we came from and possibly where we may be going.
If the keyhole formation on Mars is an artificial structure, as this scientific study suggests, could it indicate that an alien technology documented by our ancestors was left on Earth's closest neighboring planet for humanity to one day discover?
Whatever I've taken a photograph of, but when you zoom up all these NASA images, it just gets blurrier and blurrier and crappier, and that doesn't make any sense. So clearly what they're doing is they're de-resing the images so that you can't ever have a smoking gun. But you can have enough information to go forward and continue your hypothesis and talk to other people about it and show it to other people and get them to start going,
Recently, NASA gave Curiosity the best anniversary gift it could hope for, an extension of its mission for at least 2 more years. We'll use it to reach progressively higher and younger rocks on Mount Sharp, including rock types we've not yet explored. We can't wait to see how the story of the ancient habitability of Mars continues to unfold.
September 12, 2016, NASA releases images of Mars from the Murray Buttes region. JPL made a statement in USA Today that these images rival those taken in the U.S. national parks. Some photos seem to even suggest that Mars may have a slightly bluer sky than we're led to believe. It's almost as if they're putting the cameras in focus for us to even see more clearly what's on the surface of Mars. Experts like Billy Carson have been collecting these images for over a decade.
As far as Mars go, we have the most content and data on Mars because that's where the most content and data has come from the NASA research. And we've got probably around 38,000 images from Mars alone, anomalies depicting ancient civilizations that existed there in the past and possibly a small remnant remaining there right now. They're not changed in any way other than just bringing the contrast down, because what they do is they turn the contrast up and then everything is whited out. We turn the contrast down, and basically that's all we do, and we also provide direct links to the source images.
And here are the 9 strangest things spotted on Mars. Number 9, Pyramid. When this strangely angular rock was photographed by the Curiosity rover in 2015, UFO fanatics immediately cried pyramid. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the ancient Egyptians were not advanced enough to build pyramids without the help of extraterrestrials. Could this be the solution? Number 8, Rodent. Fans of the Curiosity's photo uploads were surprised to spot a small, furry mammal in this 2013 image. Commenters argued over whether it most resembled a rat, squirrel, or a gopher. Number 7, Sarcophagus. The pyramid is not the only ancient Egyptian anomaly to have been found on the Red Planet. This outcrop resembles a pharaoh's coffin with face, headdress, and possibly even a false beard. Number 6, Monolith. This large, flat object stands upright in an otherwise empty crater, resembling some kind of monument. Number 5, Gorilla. This completely unedited photo was taken by Spirit in 2003. It depicts something that undoubtedly resembles a mountain gorilla. Number 4, Face. Amongst a pile of otherwise unremarkable rubble, this boulder has oddly human-like features. The apparent beard led several media outlets to dub it the face of God. Number 3, Reptile. With eyes, legs, a tail and a mouth, this Mars anomaly took the media by storm when it surfaced in 2012. However, NASA refused to turn the rover around to investigate, as it would have cost them literally millions of dollars. Number 2, Humanoid. This photo by Curiosity shows what has been described by some as a humanoid figure. Ufologists likened its gait to the subject of Roger Patterson's 1967 video of an alleged Bigfoot. Number 1, Giant Crab. In July 2015, Curiosity beamed back a horrifying image that seemed to show a large, crab-like creature sitting in the mouth of a cave. Enhancing the image reveals a set of spindly limbs and what could be a pincer. NASA refused to investigate.
2012. Day 64 of Curiosity rover's exploration of Mars.
Curiosity rover is looking for evidence that Mars was once habitable. And to do that, we have all these amazing scientific instruments on the rover, including these incredible color cameras.
Curiosity searches the 96-mile-wide Gale crater for signs of the water that once flowed across the red planet. Among the rocks, one of Curiosity's 17 onboard cameras captures an image of something strange. The shot grabs the attention of UFO hunters.
That image goes up on the web, and there's instant fury about what it could possibly be.
Analyst Mark D'Antonio examines the image for clues.
At first glance, the image looks relatively normal. A bunch of rocks. We see this all the time on Mars. However, down here is a fairly strange object. What could it be?
In the course of exploring Mars, a number of craft have landed on the planet. NASA analysts consider the theory the unexplained object could be the remains of a rival space agency's doomed probe. Russia has launched a total of 19 craft towards Mars. Only 5 have reached the planet. But simple math rules out the idea the mysterious object is a Soviet lander.
All of the Soviet Mars series of landers from the 70s, all of which failed on descent, all of those can be accounted for.
The Soviets aren't the only space agency to send spacecraft to Mars.
Maybe it's the remains of one of our own spacecraft that crash landed on the red planet. The question is, which one?
There's only one lander whose exact landing location is not known at all, and that's the Beagle 2.
The Beagle 2, a compact European Space Agency lander, only 3 feet wide, began its descent through the Martian atmosphere on Christmas Eve 2003.
Beagle 2 entered the Martian atmosphere to go look for life at the surface of Mars. But then, contact with it was lost.
Some suggest the Beagle 2 might be the unidentified object in Curiosity's image. Analyst Mark D'Antonio compares European Space Agency photographs of Beagle 2 with Curiosity's image.
This is flat on top, so is this. It's round on the bottom, this appears to be round on the bottom. But there's a problem. This is the wrong shape. This is a longer curve, this is a shorter curve. This can't be that.
In spite of the inconsistencies, the Beagle 2 theory continues to provoke debate. Then, in December 2014, NASA receives crucial new data from its ambitious Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter.
NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has a camera called HiRISE that takes pictures with a footprint that's comparable in size to that Beagle spacecraft.
The MRO spots an unusual glint of light from the Isidis Planitia Basin. Light that could be reflected by the metallic surface of a lost craft.
Upon close inspection, it turns out that that's the Beagle 2 lander.
NASA's MRO confirms Beagle 2 rests just 2 miles from its intended touchdown. But it's 2,000 miles away from the mystery object discovered by Curiosity.
The Beagle has landed, but not anywhere near where Curiosity is scouring the landscape.
NASA's MRO solves the mystery behind the disappearance of the Beagle 2. But the solution sheds no light on the greater mystery, the strange object discovered by the Curiosity rover.
We should go boldly where man has not gone before. Fly by the comets, visit asteroids, visit the moon of Mars. There's a monolith there, a very unusual structure on this little potato-shaped object. When people find out about that, they're going to say, who put that there? Who put that there? Well, the universe.
The monolith that's on Phobos has been talked about for many, many years. And I believe that this structure, which first of all, it's miles high, number one, and you could tell by the shadow It's very easy to get a size on this. So you see that it's a supermassive structure coming up vertically out of this oblong type of a moon. I believe that the moon itself is actually artificial, and this structure potentially is artificial. It could have been a command center, a command post. It could have been a lookout overseeing the planet. It could have had many, many functional purposes, but I just don't believe it's a natural rock formation.
In 2009, a photograph was taken by one of the Mars probes of something on Mars that appeared to be sticking straight up out of the sand. Since then, numerous photographs have been taken of it. There's 4 or 5 different sets, and in all of them, it appears to look exactly like the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It has the exact same height, width, and proportion. It's casting a shadow that indicates it has this rectangular monolithic shape. And to me, the weirdest part of it is when you look at it, there's sort of a raised mound around it that it's sitting in. And when you look at the footage from 2001, where they uncover the monolith on the moon, there's this raised mound where they've dug out around the thing, and the monolith is sticking in it. And, you know, in the film, they say the only thing we know about it for sure, sir, is that it's about 4 million years old, and it appears to have been deliberately buried. And if you look at the photographs of the monolith on Phobos, you can see that the mound upon which this thing is inserted is a different color than the soil around it. It's much darker. That is an indication that somebody dug up the soil and put it around this thing to bury it, to keep it there. So it appears to be, like the monolith in 2001, an object that was deliberately buried.
But in 1998, one thing nobody on the elite NASA team expects to find is signs of construction on the surface of the red planet's largest moon.
I wasn't really looking for anything, just kind of glancing through the images, and something just popped out and struck me. I was like, whoa, what is this thing?
Instead of a featureless expanse of empty rock, Palermo sees something disturbingly regular.
What I saw kind of blew my mind away. The shadow was a lot longer than it should be. It looked like this monolithic structure.
The sighting bears little resemblance to any known natural phenomenon.
Lo and behold, there was this gigantic monolith sitting at the surface of Phobos that was essentially a towering feature. It's the size of a skyscraper.
Using the length of the shadow, scientists calculate that the odd structure is over 400 feet high.
To have a structure standing upright as big as this is, just sticking out of the surface, it's a strange phenomenon.
The structure becomes known as the Phobos monolith.
There's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that Phobos may not be a real moon, that it may be an actual artificial structure. First of all, the moon itself has been scanned, and it actually appears to be hollow. This is actual real data coming from the official space agencies. Now also, on top of that, the moon is actually losing its orbit. It's actually slightly degrading in orbit, which means it doesn't have enough mass to sustain itself, and that again tells you, it verifies the fact that it may be a hollow moon. Now when you look at very close images of this moon, or if you want to call it that, you can see these, what looks like weapons fire. It doesn't look like just random rocks were hitting it and you have little tiny pockets there. It looks like it was like when something just came across it and fired at it several times. And there's even octagonal and hexagonal anomalies on the surface of this thing, which if you were to maybe get a lot of that ancient dust off, there may be something you can see through there, or there may be some technology there as well.
And then there's that oddball photos from the Soviet space missions there in the late 80s, where they sent their own probe to Mars, which was also called Phobos, and it took a photo of this huge airship moving along right along Phobos. In fact, the airship itself was bigger than the moon.
Phobos has always been this really interesting body in the solar system. It's supposedly a moon of Mars. It appears to really just be nothing more than an asteroid. But the interesting thing about it is, as far back as 1989, when it was first photographed by the Phobos 2 probe the Russians sent up, you can see this weird wire mesh kind of cross-hatching pattern on it, even in those early images. And now when we go with newer probes like Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Global Surveyor, the ESA's Mars Express mission, they take photographs of Phobos, and we can now see in great detail that there are lines on this body running at 90-degree angles, and that's just not possible. If they're caused by boulders, I don't know how the boulders on Phobos run at 90-degree angles to each other. It's just a very, very weird phenomenon, but it fits with the idea that actually what's happening is that Phobos has this underlying sort of cross-hatching 90-degree mesh.
I think Phobos, given its orbit around Mars and its size, it's not an object that would be captured in the way a conventional moon would be captured by a planet. It's orbiting too close to Mars. And that would be indicative of some kind of artificial construction of Phobos, and that any space probes that try to get too close are simply blown out of the sky.
Many well-known scientists, like the late Carl Sagan, have speculated that a hollowed-out asteroid might make the best and safest vehicle for long-term space travel. The hard rock surface would protect inner inhabitants from radiation and the occasional strike from another asteroid. But is there an easy way to hollow out an asteroid?
How would you create a hollow moon? Well, here's how you would do it. You'd go to the asteroid belt, grab yourself a nice big asteroid, and with your super technology and whatnot, your tractor beam, you bring it to Mars or the Earth or whatever, and then, like a glass blower blows glass, you would take that asteroid, make it a molten blob, and then blow it up as molten rock, and it will solidify. And it, could be a round shape like our moon, or more sort of oddball shapes like Phobos and Deimos are. But then you're going to have a craft that's solid and sturdy, and a cavity inside it which could be occupied. And it may well be that the moons of Mars are like that, hollow, and our own moon is also possibly hollow too.
In 1989, the Russian Phobos 2 probe is taking pictures of the Martian surface when, bam, something hits it and it spirals out of control.
The Soviet Space Agency loses all contact with the probe, but not before it beams back the image from its final moments.
There's no mistaking it. The image is of a huge cylindrical object about 12 miles long.
These unusual pictures, just before the failure, appear to be a very suggestive coincidence. What was the shape of the object casting the shadow? That was the crucial question.
Does the picture reveal something that scared the Russians into ending their Mars program?
It was the end of their Mars program, not just for that year, but forever. They haven't been back to Mars since then.